The morning sun cast long shadows through the grand windows of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla stood in the blue drawing room, her fingers gripping the edge of an antique mahogany table. The usually composed monarch's face showed signs of strain that had been building for weeks. Across from her, Princess and stood tall and defiant, her military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. The two women had been circling each other like predators for months, but today something had shifted. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The confrontation had been brewing since King Charles III's recent health crisis. While the king recovered in his private chambers, questions about the monarchy's future had begun to surface. And as the king's sister and one of the hardest-working royals had taken on additional duties. But Camilla saw this as overreach, an attempt to undermine her position as queen consort. The palace staff had noticed the frost between the two women during state dinners and public appearances. They would smile for the cameras, but behind closed doors, the rivalry had grown toxic. That morning, it had made a decision that would prove to be the final straw. Without consulting Camilla, she had authorized a significant change to the upcoming state visit arrangements, citing her brother's wishes during a private conversation. When Camilla discovered this, she summoned and immediately. The Princess Royal arrived wearing her signature no-nonsense expression, prepared for yet another skirmish in their ongoing power struggle. Neither woman could have predicted how catastrophically this meeting would end. The conversation began civilly enough, with Camilla inquiring about the changes in a measured tone, and responded with equal restraint, explaining her reasoning and her authority as the king's sister. But as the minutes ticked by, voices began to rise. Camilla accused and of deliberately undermining her authority, and countered that Camilla was overstepping her bounds as a mere consort. The word mere hung in the air like a slap. Camilla's face flushed with anger, and years of carefully suppressed resentment began to bubble to the surface. "You have never accepted me," Camilla said, her voice trembling with emotion. "From the very beginning, you've treated me as an interloper, as someone unworthy of your brother's love." N's jaw tightened. "This isn't about personal feelings. This is about the monarchy, about doing what's best for the institution our family has served for generations." "Your family?" Camilla's voice rose sharply. "I am the queen. I am your brother's wife. I am part of this family whether you like it or not." The argument escalated rapidly. Old wounds were reopened, grievances aired that had been festering for decades, and brought up Camilla's past, the scandal that had once rocked the monarchy. Camilla retaliated by questioning N's judgment, suggesting that her failed marriage disqualified her from giving advice about relationships or loyalty. The personal attacks flew back and forth, each more vicious than the last. Outside the blue drawing room, palace staff began to gather, drawn by the raised voices. They exchanged worried glances but dared not intervene. The head butler, James Morrison, who had served the royal family for 30 years, had never witnessed such a heated exchange between senior royals. He quietly instructed the younger staff to keep their distance and maintain absolute discretion about what they were hearing. Inside the room, the confrontation reached a boiling point when it made a cutting remark about Camilla's children from her first marriage, suggesting they had been given privileges they hadn't earned. Camilla's composure finally shattered completely. She slammed her hand on the table, making the priceless porcelain figurines jump. "Enough!" Camilla shouted. "I have endured your contempt, your snide remarks, your constant attempts to diminish me for far too long. You forget yourself, Anne. You forget who I am." Anne's eyes flashed dangerously. "I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly what you are." The silence that followed was deafening. Both women stood facing each other, breathing heavily, the magnitude of what had been said beginning to sink in. But neither was willing to back down. The rivalry that had simmered beneath the surface of royal protocol had finally exploded into open warfare. Camilla straightened her spine, and when she spoke again, her voice was ice cold. "You have crossed a line from which there is no return. You have shown such disrespect, not just to me personally, but to the office I hold. This cannot be allowed to stand." and laughed bitterly. "And what exactly do you intend to do about it? Run crying to my brother? He knows my worth to this family, to this country. I've served with distinction for decades while you were—" "Stop." Camilla held up her hand. "Your years of service do not give you the right to insubordination. They do not give you the right to treat your queen with such contempt." The word queen seemed to inflame and further. "You may wear the crown, but respect is earned, not decreed. And you have done nothing to earn mine." What happened next would be debated in whispered conversations among palace staff for years to come. Camilla walked to the door and spoke quietly to someone outside. Within moments, two members of the Queen's Guard appeared in the doorway, their ceremonial uniforms a stark contrast to the domestic drama unfolding before them. Their faces remained impassive, but the confusion in their eyes was evident. They had been trained for many scenarios, but this was not one of them. Camilla turned back to face, and her decision made. "Princess, and your behavior today has been unacceptable. You will leave these premises immediately." Anne's face went white with shock, then red with fury. "You cannot be serious. You have no authority to—" "I have every authority," Camilla interrupted. "As queen consort, in the absence of the king, I am acting in his stead, and I'm telling you to leave. Now." The guards shifted uncomfortably, caught between two of the most senior members of the royal family. They looked between the two women, clearly hoping someone would tell them this was all a misunderstanding. The tension in the room was unbearable, and looked at the guards, then back at Camilla. "This is madness. When Charles hears about this, the king will hear about everything," Camilla said coldly, "including your insubordination and your deliberate attempts to undermine the crown. Guards, please escort Her Royal Highness from the palace." The younger of the two guards cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should—" "That was not a request," Camilla said sharply. "That was a command from your queen." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity, and stood perfectly still, her military training keeping her posture rigid despite the humiliation. She looked at the guards, these men who had served her family faithfully, now being asked to choose sides in a battle they never should have witnessed. Finally, and spoke, her voice quiet but filled with venom. "You have made a terrible mistake today, Camilla. One that will have consequences far beyond what you can imagine." She turned on her heel and walked toward the door, her head held high. The guards, relieved that they wouldn't have to physically escort her, fell into step behind her. As they walked through the palace corridors, staff members pressed themselves against walls, trying to become invisible. The news spread like wildfire through the servants' quarters and administrative offices. The queen had ordered Princess Anne to leave the palace. It was unprecedented. As Anne walked through the grand entrance hall, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor, she paused at the door. She turned back to look at the palace that had been her family's home for generations, where she had played as a child, where she had celebrated and mourned, where she had dedicated her life to service. The betrayal stung more deeply than she would ever admit. Meanwhile, Camilla remained in the blue drawing room, her hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. The magnitude of what she had just done was beginning to sink in. She had crossed a Rubicon from which there would be no easy return. The relationship with her sister-in-law, always fragile, was now shattered beyond repair. Within an hour, the news had reached King Charles in his recovery room. His private secretary, Sir Edward Hastings, had the unenviable task of explaining what had transpired. The king's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, sadness, and, finally, a deep weariness. "Bring me a telephone," he said quietly. "I need to speak with both of them." But Anne was not answering her phone. She had returned to her own residence, Gatcombe Park, and instructed her staff that she was not to be disturbed. She needed time to process what had happened, to consider her next moves. The humiliation burned hot in her chest. To be escorted from her own family's palace, like a common trespasser, was beyond insulting. Back at Windsor, Camilla was pacing in her private apartments. The righteous anger that had fueled her actions was giving way to uncertainty. She knew Charles would be upset, but she had to make him understand. Anne's constant undermining, her refusal to accept Camilla's position, had made this confrontation inevitable. When the king's call finally came through, Camilla steeled herself. "Charles, darling, I can explain." "Not now, Camilla." The king's voice was tired and strained. "We will discuss this when I am stronger. But know that you have created a crisis where none needed to exist. And as my sister, she has served this family and this country with distinction for longer than, well, for a very long time. This should never have happened." The call ended, leaving Camilla feeling more isolated than ever. She had won the battle, but at what cost? The palace staff were avoiding her, their usual deference now tinged with something else. Fear, perhaps, or disapproval. The queen who had commanded the guards to escort a princess royal from the palace was a queen to be wary of. As night fell over Windsor Castle, the palace was unusually quiet. The normal bustle of evening activities was subdued, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. In her apartments, Camilla sat alone, wondering if she had just secured her position or signed her own downfall. At Gackham Park, and was far from idle. She had begun making phone calls, reaching out to allies within the family and the establishment. If Camilla wanted a war, she would get one. But it would be fought on Anne's terms, with the weapons of influence, tradition, and public opinion that she had spent a lifetime mastering. The British public, still unaware of the drama that had unfolded behind palace walls, would soon be drawn into the conflict. Team Team Camilla would emerge, dividing not just the royal watchers, but the nation itself. The monarchy, already facing challenges in a modern world, would be tested like never before. As the clock struck midnight, marking the end of one of the most dramatic days in recent royal history, both women lay awake in their respective beds, planning their next moves. The palace intrigue that had always simmered beneath the surface of royal life had exploded into open conflict, and there would be no going back. The following morning brought no respite. The first editions of the newspapers had somehow gotten wind of the story. "Palace panic," screamed one headline. "Camilla banishes," and declared another. The palace press office was in crisis mode, trying to craft a statement that would explain the inexplicable without causing further damage. Sir Edward Hastings convened an emergency meeting of senior palace officials. The mood was grim as they discussed damage control. How could they possibly spin this? The queen consort ordering the princess royal to leave the palace was not something that could be easily explained away as a misunderstanding. "We could say princess and left of her own accord after a disagreement," suggested the press secretary. "That would require Princess Anne's cooperation," Sir Edward pointed out. "And given the circumstances, I doubt that will be forthcoming." Indeed, and had already instructed her own team to say nothing while she considered her options. She was a strategist, and she knew that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. Let Camilla and her team scramble to explain. Let them tie themselves in knots, trying to justify the unjustifiable. At Buckingham Palace, Prince William and Catherine were following the developments with growing alarm. William, as heir to the throne, knew he would eventually have to take a position in this conflict. His relationship with Camilla had always been cordial, but distant, while Anne had been a constant presence throughout his life, a link to his grandmother and the traditions of the monarchy. "This is a disaster," William said to Catherine as they discussed the situation in private. "The last thing the monarchy needs is a public feud between senior members of the family." Catherine, ever the diplomat, suggested reaching out to both parties to attempt a reconciliation. But William knew his aunt well enough to know that her pride had been wounded, and wounded pride in the House of Windsor was not easily healed. Prince Harry, watching from California, felt a mix of emotions. Part of him felt vindicated. Here was proof that the palace could be a toxic environment, that the power struggles and petty jealousies he had spoken about were real. But another part of him felt sad for his family, trapped in cycles of conflict that seemed to repeat generation after generation. As the day wore on, the crisis deepened. Members of Parliament began to ask questions about the role of the Queen Consort and her authority in the King's absence. Constitutional experts debated on television about the limits of Camilla's power. The Republican movement, always looking for opportunities to question the relevance of the monarchy, seized on the drama as evidence of an institution out of touch with modern values. Camilla, isolated in her palace apartments, began to realize the full extent of what she had unleashed. Every hour brought new complications, new critics, new problems. Her supporters were few and far between. Wallen's decades of public service had earned her a reservoir of goodwill that was now being deployed against the queen consort. The king, still recovering, was receiving hourly updates. His doctors warned against stress, but how could he remain calm when his family was tearing itself apart? He knew he needed to act, but what could he do? Support his wife and risk alienating his sister permanently? Or side with and undermine his own queen? As the sun set on another tumultuous day, preparations were being made for an unprecedented royal summit. The king had summoned both Camilla and to Sandringham, neutral ground where they would thrash out their differences away from the prying eyes of palace staff. Whether reconciliation was possible remained to be seen, and arrived first, her convoy sweeping through the Norfolk countryside in the early morning mist. She had spent the journey reviewing a dossier her team had prepared, a comprehensive list of grievances against Camilla, documented instances of overreach, and legal opinions on the limits of a queen consort's authority. Camilla's arrival an hour later was more subdued. She had wanted to arrive with full royal ceremony, but Charles had vetoed that idea. This was to be a family meeting, not a state occasion. She entered Sandringham feeling like she was walking into an ambush. The king, looking frielier than either woman had expected, was waiting in the drawing room. The sight of him, clearly affected by the stress of recent events, gave both women pause. Whatever their differences, they both loved this man, and seeing him suffering because of their conflict was sobering. "Sit," Charles said simply, gesturing to chairs on opposite sides of the fireplace. "We're going to resolve this today, one way or another. The monarchy cannot afford this division. Our family cannot afford it. And, frankly, I cannot afford it." What followed was one of the most difficult conversations in royal history. Charles, with the skill of a man who had spent his entire life navigating palace politics, slowly drew out the real issues underlying the conflict. It wasn't just about protocol or authority. It was about acceptance, respect, and the complex dynamics of a blended family thrust into the spotlight of hereditary monarchy, and spoke of her frustration at seeing traditions she held dear being changed or discarded. She talked about her fear that the monarchy was losing its way, becoming more about celebrity than service. She admitted, with difficulty, that accepting Camilla had been harder than she'd expected, that every time she saw her in their mother's jewels or standing where their mother had stood, it felt like a betrayal. Camilla, for her part, spoke of the impossible position of being the second wife, of trying to find her place in an institution that seemed designed to exclude her. She talked about the constant comparisons to Diana, the knowledge that she would never be fully accepted by some, and how Anne's attitude had made an already difficult situation almost unbearable. Charles listened to both women, occasionally interjecting to clarify a point or to remind them of shared experiences, times when they had worked well together. Slowly, painfully, the heat began to drain from the conflict. "I should not have ordered you to leave," Camilla finally admitted. It was an overreaction born of frustration and anger, and nodded stiffly. "And I should not have provoked you. My words were chosen to wound, and that was unworthy of me." It was not a warm reconciliation. Too much had been said, too much damage done for that. But it was a détente, an agreement to coexist for the sake of the institution they all served. They would be civil in public, coordinate their activities to avoid conflict, and work through intermediaries when necessary. As they prepared to leave Sandringham, Charles pulled an aside. "She is my wife," he said simply. "I need you to remember that," and looked at her brother, seeing not the king, but the boy she had grown up with, the man who had waited so long for happiness. "I know," she said softly. "I'll try harder." The crisis that had threatened to tear the royal family apart was over, at least publicly. The palace press office released a carefully worded statement about a miscommunication that had been resolved through family discussion. The media, sensing there was more to the story but lacking concrete details, eventually moved on to other scandals. But in the corridors of power, the reverberations continued. Camilla's position, while secure, had been damaged. She had shown a capacity for harsh action that made even her supporters wary. And, meanwhile, had demonstrated that she remained a force to be reckoned with, that decades of service had given her a power base that even a queen could not easily overcome. The palace staff returned to their routines, but with a new awareness of the fragility of the royal ecosystem. The guards who had been commanded to escort and out became minor celebrities in their barracks, their story told and retold with increasing embellishment. As life at court returned to something approaching normal, both women carried the scars of their confrontation. They appeared together at state occasions, smiled for the cameras, and performed their duties with professionalism. But those who knew them well could see the careful distance they maintained, the way they avoided being alone together, the subtle tension that never quite dissipated. The monarchy had survived another crisis, as it had survived so many before. But the question remained, how many more such conflicts could it endure before the foundations began to crack? In an age where every royal drama was dissected on social media, where public opinion could shift in an instant, the personal had become dangerously political. As Christmas approached, the royal family gathered as tradition demanded. The photographs released to the public showed a united front, smiling faces around a decorated tree. But those who looked closely might have noticed how Camilla stood at opposite ends of the group, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. The palace that had held its breath as Camilla commanded the guards to escort and out had exhaled, but the air remained charged with the potential for future storms. The two women had found a way to coexist, but true peace remained elusive. In the Game of Thrones that was royal life, there were no permanent victories, only temporary truces. And so life continued with its ceremonies and duties, its public faces and private tensions. The monarchy endured, adapted, and evolved as it always had. But those who had witnessed the events of that extraordinary day knew that something fundamental had shifted. The palace would never quite be the same again, and neither would the women who had stood at the center of the storm. In her private moments, Camilla sometimes wondered if she had won or lost that day. She had asserted her authority, but at a cost that was still being calculated. And, for her part, had learned that even a lifetime of service did not make one untouchable, that the rules of the game could change in an instant. The story of that day became part of palace lore, whispered about by new staff members, analyzed by royal biographers, and debated by constitutional scholars. It served as a reminder that behind the pageantry and protocol, the royal family was still a family, with all the complexity and conflict that entailed. Years later, when both women were older and the heat of that day had cooled to a distant memory, they could sometimes be seen exchanging knowing looks across a crowded room. They would never be friends, but they had developed a grudging respect for each other's strength. They had tested each other's limits and found them formidable. The palace had held its breath that day, and in some ways it was still holding it, waiting for the next crisis, the next test of wills. But for now there was peace, however fragile, and that was enough. The crown endured, the institution survived, and life at court went on, with all its grandeur and all its very human dramas playing out behind closed doors.